couple of weeks ago, I introduced the new speaker series for this year. And our topic this year is, what if we made a trip, a study trip, not to Spain or Peru, I'm waiting for a yay or something, Peru, but to the United States. How would we introduce religion, ritual, the arts in the United States to a group like us? And we are going to have a very interesting group of speakers lined up for this semester. But we have to start with a very basic and general question, and that is, what actually is religion in America? What are the trends in the congregations? What are the trends in religion and the arts? And there could be nobody better than Mark Chaves to introduce us to this topic. He holds a joint appointment at Duke Divinity School, the Sociology Department, and the Religious Studies Department. And he teaches courses on the social organization of American religion. But even more important, his research focuses on the social organization of religion in the United States. He's involved in a large study of congregations in the United States, and his talk today will be in part based on, or to a large part based on this study. And he will introduce us, first of all, to general trends of religion and religiosity and faith in the United States, and then in the second half of his talk, narrow in on especially religion and the arts. So please welcome Mark Chaves.
Thanks, Marcus. Thanks very much for having me. I'm looking forward to the time together. I've had a good day so far. I'm looking forward to the rest of it. I'm going to jump right in. This talk really has two parts. The first part one is about trends in American religion, as Mark said, some basic things that are going on, some of which will be familiar with you, maybe all of it will be familiar, I think probably not. And then the second part, I'm going to focus in on the intersection of congregations and the arts and say a little bit about that I hope you'll find interesting. So that's where we're going. We have until 5 o'clock. The trends part in particular, there's tons more to say than I can say in the time here, and feel free to ask questions along the way. Is what I want to say is if there's some detail that you want to know about that we can spend a little more time on up front. I don't mind doing that. I don't have to get through all of the trends as I've prepared them, so I'm happy to talk about what you're interested in talking about if you want to do that. If it gets to be about 4:35 or so, and we haven't finished the trends, that's fine. I'll jump to the congregations and the arts part because I do want to get to that since we're at the Institute for Sacred Music. So feel free to just raise your hand if you want to know something more than what I say about any of these initial trends. Most of the data that what I'm going to tell you is based on one of two different data sources. One is called the General Social Survey, which is a big national survey of individuals that's been going on since 1972. It's the main source of information about trends in American religion. Everybody knows about the Pew studies because they get all the press for some reason, but the General Social Survey is really the fundamental source of done by NORC at the University of Chicago. Lots of this from there. The other main data source behind a lot of what I'm going to tell you is from the National Congregation Study, which is a big national survey of congregations that I run that's been going on since 1998. So it's a main source of information about trends in congregations, not over as long of a time frame, but since 1998. And so I'm not going to say a lot methodologically about those, but those are the two main sources of data that a lot of what I'm going to show you comes from. Okay, so we'll jump right in. The trends. Before I get to the trends, we need to say that Americans is very religious by world standards. You probably know this, but it's important because a theme of the trends is that we are in a period of religious decline, slow religious decline. But we have to put that in the context of ongoing, continuing by world standards, it's very high levels of religiosity. 57% of Americans say that they not just believe in God, but know God exists. About 90% believe in God in some fashion. 80% believe in life after death. 2/3 believe in heaven. Half believe in hell, because Americans are optimists, of course, so more believe in heaven than in hell. That's an interesting fact. But the main point here is that those are very large numbers by world standards, by modern Western standards. It's not just belief, also practice. 70% of Americans say they pray at least several times a week. A fifth say they read the Bible. When we get into the nitty-gritty a little bit, we can talk about, this is what people say they do. There's another question about what people actually do, of course. That is, I could do a whole talk on that. 40% say they had a born-again experience. Again, just the general point to start us off, you have to say two things at once. We're a very religious country. We remain a very religious country, even in the context of a period of decline. So you have to keep both those things in mind at the same time. Some things have changed. I've pulled out 8 trends. There are 45 different trends I could tell you about. Marcus was very helpful in helping me pull out these 8 of all the different ones I could talk about. So if you find these boring or uninformative or you knew it all, so it's his fault, it's not my fault. I've trusted him, his judgment about what you might find to be most important. So you probably know about this. We're a more religious diverse country, but it's important to start here. This is a major trend in American religion, more religious diversity, and not just religious diversity as a demographic fact, but more acceptance of religious diversity as, I would even say, appreciation of religious diversity as a cultural fact. Both of those things are true. Here's some details, and here's the first big graph. This is the basic trends in the big categories of religious affiliation. This is based on a question that just asks people, what's your religion? What's your religious affiliation? Is it Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, something else, or nothing at all? The most famous part of this trend is this. These are the increase in the nuns. You've probably all heard about that, right? The increasing number of people who say they have, if asked, what's your religion, say, I have none. And that really has increased quite a lot. It's now about 20% of the population. It's increased at a pretty fast rate. As recently as the 1990s, only 10% of the people said that they had no religious affiliation when asked. This is actually a long-term trend. We have a data point on this back in the 1950s where only 3% of the American population said, I have no religion. So this is a long-term trend of people saying that they have no religion. It's very important to recognize what this does and doesn't mean. This is not about religious participation. It's not about going to church. It's not about believing in God. It's about simply saying, when asked, what's your religion, I'm something or I'm nothing. And what's happened recently is more people who were basically religiously inactive, more of them kind of take this final step and say, yeah, you know what, I'm nothing. In the 1980s or 1990s, more of those people would still say, I'm Catholic, I'm Baptist, I'm whatever. A bigger chunk of those people are now saying, no, I'm not. There's a whole story about why that is and what's produced that, but that's big. Note that this has come mainly at the expense of declining share of the Protestant population. Relatively recently, we became less than 50% Protestant for the first time in our history, an important symbolic boundary. There's, of course, increasing numbers. It's not obvious here because it's still a relatively small percentage, but of Muslim, Hindu, Buddhists, and others, that's actually increased from 1-ish% to 4-ish% over this period, which is, some people are surprised by how low that still is, but that's what it is. One thing I feel always compelled to say here is that you'll often hear people say there are more Muslims than Jews in the United States. It's not true. There are about as many Muslim, Hindus, and Buddhists combined as there are Jews in the United States. It's a whole other story about why people think that, but we don't have time to go into that. So anyway, this is the basic story of increased more nuns, more people who aren't Protestant or Catholic. But it's not just a demographic shift. It's also a cultural shift, an increasing acceptance, which is evident in several ways. One way is there's long-term surveys asking various ways of Christians, do you believe that Christianity is the one true faith? And fewer people say that. Fewer Christians say that. Even fewer evangelicals say that. More evangelicals say that than other kinds of Christians, but even a majority of evangelicals will say, no, I don't believe that. Pew did a survey like this a few years ago, and they were so shocked by the percentage of evangelicals that said, no, I don't think that they said, there must have been something wrong. It must have been that it was like Baptists kind of grudgingly admitting that Methodists could go to heaven or something like that. So they redid the survey to clarify that, and the bottom line is it wasn't that. It was people really were thinking of people in other religions. There's a long-term set of questions where people ask various categories of, would you vote for, obviously ask Protestants, would you vote for a Catholic, Christians, would you vote for a Jew? Almost everybody now says I'd vote for a Catholic or a Jew if they were president. More than half, 60% of Americans now say they'd vote for an atheist for president. 60% say they'd vote for a Muslim for president. But probably the best measure is the religious intermarriage, which has been increasing steadily over this period. Now about a third of marriages are across those broad religious divides that are in that first graph, are religiously intermarried. And that's obviously a very important feature, because it means that it's not just that the country as a whole is more religiously diverse. Extended families are more religiously diverse. Lots and lots of people, Bob Putnam, the political scientist who wrote the book American Grace, talks about the Aunt Susan effect. Almost everybody has an Aunt Susan who's of a different religion than they are. And that, makes, it's true in friendship groups as well. Our friendship groups have become more religiously diverse, but it's true of extended families. It doesn't take that much religious intermarriage to make extended families religious diverse. So in the United States, it's not just that we have more religious diversity as a society, but we have more religious diversity in our everyday lives, in both our friend networks and our families, with lots of consequences. And obviously these demographic facts are related to these cultural facts, and there's a chicken and egg, which comes first. Do you grow more tolerant because you know more people who are, but then that has a reinforcing effect, so it's a positive reinforcement loop. And obviously there's unevenness in all this across religious groups. People non-Muslims are less happy about Muslims, think less highly, maybe that's the way to put it, about Muslims in the United States and others, but even that is shifting. Okay, so that's the first trend. Second trend, and that trend's not really about decline, except for maybe the increase in the nuns, but these next two are about this decline story. That's an important part of the story. I showed you before that 89% of people in the most recent General Social Survey say in some fashion or another they believe in God. I want to show you the actual question that comes from. This has been being asked since the 80s, I think. People are given these choices. Tell me which one comes closest to what you think about belief in God. I don't believe in God. I don't know whether there is a God. I don't believe there's any way to find out. I don't believe in a personal God, but I do believe in a higher power. I find myself believing in God some of the time, not others. Well, I have doubts. I feel that I do believe in God. I know God really exists, and I have no doubts about it. That 89% thing I showed you earlier is, I think it's these four together. So people who said one of those four, you add those up, and it gets to be about 90%. 89%. That 89% is kind of significant, sort of, as well, because for the first time, it's under 90%. So this is the belief in God one is a nice illustration of these two things we have to keep in mind. 89% of people believing in God is a really big number. It's almost everybody. But 50 years ago, it was 97%. And, so it's the simultaneous, very high remaining religiosity, but still a picture of slow decline. But what I want to show you to illustrate that is the trend in this one, the strongest, the people who say, I know God really exists, and I have no doubts about it, and this is what that looks like. And as you can tell, it's, see, I got through all of this already. It's declined. That's the story. It was in the 1990s, about 2/3 of the people said it, and now it's, it was 57, I think, percent. That's slow decline, but decline. All of this story of decline, by the way, is is about generational differences, about younger people less likely to say they believe in God. And what I'm going to show you now, it's about practice as well, declining involvement in religious congregations, meaning church attendance, is also slowly declining. This is the line from the General Social Survey, the percent who, implied by the General Social Survey, who would, by what they say, it implies they attend every week. In the 70s, it was, it hovered between 40 and 45%, and now it's about 35%. Slow decline. Now here, I mentioned before this issue of, the difference between what people say they do and what they do. People lie about how often they go to church. Even to scientific, rigorous social survey researchers, no matter how hard we try to tell them, plead with them not to lie to us, they do. The true percentage is down here, between 20 and 25%. We know this because of a variety of studies. My colleagues and I did a study a while ago that first established this, where we trickily, in an area, did the survey, and the survey said 40% of the people said, but then we went into churches and we counted who was there, and it was about 20%. It was double in but since then, and this is a good insight into why this is, because it's an interesting cultural fact that there's that difference, is that it's not the people who never go who say that lie and tell you they go. It's the people who kind of regularly go, but maybe it's monthly and not weekly, but they think of themselves as church people. And so when you ask them, even if you literally ask them, I just want to know, were you there last Sunday? I believe you're a church person. I know that, but I want to know literally. They'll still think to themselves, well, if I say no, they won't understand that I'm really a church person. And so it's an identity display. It's not exactly a lie. It's you know what I mean? That's you can put yourself in that position of I call you up and I say, I want to know, did you go last week? Or the version of the General Social is, how often do you go? And maybe it's monthly, but you don't really want to say once a month, so you say weekly. It's kind of a default. Part of the reason so it's the people who often go who overstate how much they go, and this is very similar to what people do with voting. People overstate how much they vote. It's not people who never vote who lie and say they vote. It's people who usually vote, but for whatever reason didn't vote in the last election, who will cause it. Part of the reason we know this is the right interpretation, because there's a kind of survey called a time diary survey, where it's very sneaky. You call people up on a Monday, and you say, I'm doing a study about how people use their time, and I'd like to know what you did yesterday. Let's start at 8 a.m. What did you do at 8 a.m.? What did you do at 9 a.m.? What did you do at 10 a.m.? You never mention going to church or attending religious services, so you don't evoke their identity. And this is what you get when you ask that question. That fewer people. So even through survey, just a different kind of survey, if you don't use the words attend church, you drop it by a pretty substantial amount. So two takeaways. One is on an average Sunday, on average weekend, it's more like 20 to 25%, I think closer to 20% of people attend religious services, that not 40, which is still a fact you'll hear stated a lot. But secondly, no matter how you measure it, you see the decline, the slow decline over time. So we're in a place of decline. Way more to say about this, but I'll keep going. If anything's going up, it's something that I refer to as diffused spirituality. One kind of well-known phenomenon that people know about that I think of in these terms is the people who say they're spiritual but not religious. And this is a growing percent of the population. In 1998, most everybody, by the way, in the United States says they're spiritual and religious. Something like 85% of the people will say that. I guess it's down to 80% now. As recently as 98, only 9% of people said they were spiritual but not religious, and now it's more than about double that. Young people are more likely to say this than older people, but it's increasing in every group. The people who are the nuns who say they have no religious affiliation, they're more likely to say this than others, but it's increasing even among the people who say they have a traditional religious affiliation. And this is partly because more people say they're not religious, but it's also because more of the people who say they're not religious say that they're spiritual. people want these days to say that they're spiritual, which is a whole other thing we could talk a lot about what people mean by that. And this is usually interpreted as kind of, I'm not into institutional religion, but I'm not materialist. I don't want to be, spiritual somehow is, I think there's a meaning in life or something like that. And so that's out there. A big debate at the moment related to both the nuns and this phenomenon is whether these people represent a mobilizable group of people, that they're interested enough in religion and religious ideas and religious concerns or spiritual concerns to be recruited into some new form of institutional religion or organized religion or religious movement. The answer is no, they're not. I'll just cut to the chase. These people are not, these are not religious seekers mainly. They're pretty much uninterested in religion, but they do, at least they want to display a certain kind of spirituality for themselves. So they maybe buy spiritually themed self-help books or something like that, but I don't think that. But this is a debate, let me just say, about whether, if some religious entrepreneur could just figure out how to reach these people, they'd come back to some form of organized religion. I don't think that's true, but it remains to be seen. It might be true. There's certainly always new people trying, and we have gone through times of new religious movements that have pulled people in, so it's not impossible, but I think it's unlikely. Okay, so the summary point is that there's this slow decline in traditional religious belief. And it's slow is an important part of that. This is not dramatic. That church attendance trend is, it's something like 1/4 percentage point a year over decades or something like that. It's very easy to miss. We did miss it for a long time because we didn't have data over a long enough period of time to see it. But it's not that it's only just started. It's been going on for decades, it's now clear. It's that we couldn't see it until recently because we didn't have enough data over a long enough period of time to discern it. It's kind of like you need a big enough telescope to resolve the light to find enough place to rule out the noise. Okay, some trends in congregations then. Well, the first one is related to the decline story, which is declining average size, which is not the most interesting thing about size in congregations. I'm going to tell you what the most interesting thing is, but there is declining average size, which is consistent with the overall decline in participation. This is now from the National Congregation Study. We measure it's a big national survey of congregations from across the religious spectrum. We measure size in a bunch of different ways, kind of how many regular, because of course member means something different in different traditions. So how many regular participants you have, that's maybe the easy to understand measure. It was 80 in 1998, it's 70 now. How many attendees at your main worship service, from 70 to 60? How many attendees at all your, from 9, they're all down is the point. So the average congregation, the median size of a congregation in the United States is 70 participants, small. The average congregation is small. But there's a very important trend having to do with size that I want to tell you about that, and that's the increasing concentration of people in the largest congregations. The basic thing that's happening is that the average congregation is getting smaller, but more and more people are in the biggest. Everybody knows about megachurches, but this is a much broader phenomenon than just the stereotypical megachurch. So people are moving from smaller and medium-sized churches into bigger and bigger churches. And this is one of the favorite graphs that I've ever produced in my life, so I show it every time that I can. I just love this graph because this is not from either of the studies. I've collected this data in other ways. This is about a dozen different Protestant denominations, and it's showing you within each of these denominations the percent of people in the biggest 1% of churches. So concentration, yeah.
Is there a specific number that you are using in order to determine what constitutes a small, medium, or large church in terms of average attendance, or that's even the measure you use?
I don't personally think in those categories, because any category would be arbitrary. The people who study megachurches tend to cut it at 2,000 regular attendance, but that's obviously arbitrary. So that's why I'm just showing you, I'm just showing you the numbers of people without putting them into categories. And in this one, I'm just saying what's the percent in the very biggest, whatever the size is. And this is an amazing graph to me because, so that's a dozen different denominations. As you can see, it's liberal ones, it's conservative ones, it's big ones, it's small ones, it's ones that have declined over this period, it's ones that have not declined over this period, but in every single one of them, they show this concentration trend. From 1900 till about sometime in the 1970s, let's call that basically stable. No increase, certainly, in concentration, people moving into the biggest. In the 1970s, it's as if someone flipped a switch and people started moving into the biggest, across the Protestant spectrum. Notice the Episcopal churches here. The biggest 1% of churches in the Episcopal church means 700 people or something. So it's not your stereotypical megachurch. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is there. The Reformed Church of America was Crystal Cathedral, of course. But anyway, you get the point. Across the spectrum, it's not just about the stereotypical megachurch. It's people are moving into these. I think this is maybe the most important, it's one of the most important trends and developments in American religion. Yeah. Because it's so extreme among the Assemblies of God that because they're like at 35% or something of people in the biggest. They're so concentrated that you wouldn't be able to see the differences between the other groups if I put them on this graph. So it's true of the Assemblies of God. And by the way, on that in general, I haven't cherry picked here. This is every single denomination that I could get the data on. It's all there, So if there's an exception out there, I haven't found it. They're all over the place, really. I mean, you can go on and look at maps, the people who study megachurches and the
cities versus suburbs.
They're everywhere, really. I mean, it's probably mainly suburbs, but certainly they're in urban areas as well. But it's amazing to me. I live in North Carolina. You drive through North Carolina, and outside some little town, there's a big worship center or something. There are some geographical patterns, but they're not limited, certainly, to any one place. Anyway, so somebody flipped a switch in the 1970s, and people started going. I mean, I could do a whole talk. In fact, I have a whole talk. You can invite me back, and I could do it on what this may or may not be about. But I think it's very important. It confuses people because it looks like it's increased religion. It's because of this phenomenon that people think there's more religiosity in the United States because they're so much more visible. One 2,000 person church is a lot more visible than 10 200 person churches. And the pastor of that church is a player in the town or the city. And the politicians are, obviously they're more attractive groups to be. And they have, so that it can increase religion's social influence, political influence, economic importance in an area. So those are all important consequences. But it doesn't mean there's more people going to church, because I already showed you there's not more people going to church. So of course the ideology from the megachurch leaders is we're reaching the unchurched, but no, they're not. It's the Walmart that they're pulling people out of the smaller and medium-sized churches is what's going on. So I think it's a very important.
Is there any other comparable measure of institutions, businesses, or voluntary
Yes.
organizations with similar patterns of essentially economies of scale?
Yes. Yes. And if I was doing the full talk on this, I could tell you all about that. The bottom line that I'm going to have to limit at that because of the time is that there are trends like this in retail, in other, but the explanations that people who have studied the concentrations in those others, I don't think quite work for this. I'm just going to have to leave it at that. But yes, you can compare that and you can think about the explanations for that and do they apply here. I don't think it's just a society-wide thing that this is a religious, I think we need some kind of special religious explanation for it. But sorry, I know it's unsatisfying, but the clock's ticking. Okay, so I think this is really important. And also, by the way, really important for the congregation in the arts, because obviously it affects where the jobs are. Who has money to pay a musician anymore, and especially full-time, real jobs as opposed to, you know what I mean. Okay, another kind of trend that is neither here nor there with respect to decline, but it's very important, is more ethnic diversity. I already talked about more religious diversity, but there's also more ethnic diversity within American Christianity and within American religion more generally. You probably know this. There's several senses in which this is true, two of which I'm sure you know about. The third one, maybe not, but I think is interesting. The first sense is simply more congregations where no one group makes up more than 80%. You know, you might think of them as truly diverse or deeply diverse. You know, no one group makes more than 80%. In 1998, that was 15%. In 2012, most recent point we have data was up to 20%. So there's more of these kind of churches. They're still obviously a minority. They're very unstable often. They're often, you know, moving from basically being a white church to a black church is the main direction. But there are more of them than there used to be. A second sense in which American religion is more ethnically diverse is simply more congregations out there that are not white, that, you know, more Hispanic congregations, more ethnic, more Asian congregations. Whether or not they're mixed, they're just more, the congregational population is more ethnically diverse. The third sense, though, and this is the sense that I think gets overlooked, and in a way, I don't want to say it's the most important, but I don't think it's trivial. And that is, there's more congregations that remain predominantly white, but that have some minority presence. More congregations that remain predominantly white, but that have some, so if we just look at what percent, actually this is probably the clearest, I'll just go right to here. As recently as 1998, 20% of congregations were 100% white and non-Hispanic. That's 11% in 20. So by the way, we're doing this survey again right now. So I will have updated numbers of this. If you invite me back next year, there could be a fourth bar, and I can tell you what it means. So this graph shows it better. This is just looking at predominantly white congregations and asking how many of them have more than 0 Hispanics. You know, up from 28% to 35-ish%. More than 0 Asian, from 18% to 24%. When I first saw this, I thought this is all about immigration. But it's not, because if you look at African American, black people as well, the percent of a predominantly white churches that are more than, have some black people in them. You know, it might just be one black family, or, you know, 4 black professionals or something. 32% in 1990, 44% now. So there's fewer churches that are 100%. Sometimes I do this, people say this is trivial. This is about, you know, it doesn't matter if a predominantly white church has just one Hispanic family in it. But I'm not so sure about that. I think a minister talks differently about certain kinds of issues if he or she knows there's even any Hispanic people or black people in the room, if it's a predominantly white church. So I don't think it's so trivial. I think it's a real thing. It's not true in black churches, by the way. There's no increase among predominantly black churches that have some white people in them. But in white churches, there's more. Fewer of them are literally 100% white, and I think it's worth reflecting on what that means, because I think it's a real thing. I think it's going to continue, and it's in a way it's the main type of ethnic diversity in churches that is out there, is the predominantly white church with a small number of ethnic minorities in them. Okay. The 8th trend is, you probably know about this, more informal worship. Informal is maybe not the right word, but I think you probably know what I mean by it. In the National Congregation Study, each time we do it, we say, okay, think about your most recent main worship service, and here's a list of 20 things that may or may not have happened in it, and tell me what happened. Tell me whether that happened in your main worship service. So kind of within this study of congregations, there's kind of a little embedded study of worship services and the features of worship services, so we can study the changes in worship services. And these are only a few of them, but basically, for any of them, any element that could be interpreted as about, you know, informality or formality or more enthusiastic or more contemporary worship style, anything that could be interpreted in that way is moving in that direction over this period. So people testifying, you know, besides the main leader has gone up. People jumping and shouting, just applause. People raising their hands in praise, the use of drums. There's some other things. The use of written programs has declined. Interestingly, the use of just traditional choirs has declined, particularly among, well, maybe only among white Protestants, both evangelical and mainline. So this is interesting. It'll be very interesting to see in 2018 whether this continues along this way, or whether presumably there's some plateau out there of hitting. That's true, by the way, of the concentration. There's got to be a plateau, because if there's no plateau, we all wind up in one giant church, which seems unlikely at the end of the day. But we haven't hit the plateau yet. I've looked at that more recently. It's still going. And it'll be interesting to see in 2018 whether this is continuing. Obviously, this is something else because a lot of this is about music in the worship service. So in the 2018 study, we have a few other items to kind of pick up some of these worship styles. Like, is there a time when people sing, 3 or 4 songs in a row, as kind of pick up the thing that happens in contemporary worship? Is there? It's obviously changing all the time, the details, because of technology. And one thing we're going to ask about in 2018 is not just do they project. In 1998, the question was, do you use overhead projectors in your, which seems, so ridiculous now. Now, we still say projection equipment. But do you project not just song lyrics, but do you project images of the speakers? Which I think is kind of a cool, interesting, it says something about what's going on in the worship if they're putting, giant pictures of the musicians or the speakers. So anyway, so we'll have more to say about how widespread this kind of worship style is. But it's moving in that direction. This, I do think, is part of a larger cultural shift towards informality in culture in various ways. And that shows up that people have studied about. Use of formal titles has declined, and obviously dress standards have shifted in an informal direction. So one could put this in the context of a larger shift towards informality in culture.
Do you see any results even now as you're building the next study with blended worship? Where there may be an increase of this, but there's still a choir,
Yeah. It could be. I haven't looked at that directly. One could use the data to look at different combinations, since we do ask about each of these things separately. So somebody could do that for their thesis or project or something, to look at that. Yeah, that would be interesting to look at all the... We do ask questions about, because another thing that happens, of course, is different worship services with different styles. And we do ask questions about that. If you have more than one worship service, are they basically the same, or are they different? If they're different, how? So we have information about that. But one could take this list of elements, worship elements, and look at the combinations of them. All this data is public, by the way. Both the General Social Survey, and that you could right now, probably on your phone, go to the website and download the data and reproduce. And everything I'm telling you here can be reproduced or studied in other kinds of ways. And so I'd encourage you to do that.
One of the things I've heard more about recently is digitally mediated worship, meaning worship that is performed in one location and then simulcasted somewhere else.
Yeah.
Or worship that's designed exclusively for the internet. Has that phenomenon existed enough for there to be data?
Yes. So in 2012 is the first time we asked about in the context of multi-site. So not so much just virtual, but the multi-site phenomenon. In 2012, I think it was 11% of people were in multi-site congregations, which that's a pretty remarkable high number.
11% of Americans?
Yes. Yeah, this is about the United States, yes. It'll be very interesting to see. I expect that to go up in 2018. And we did ask questions about if they're in a multi-site, are they watching the same, are things being projected in? That's yet another thing I haven't looked at in a lot of detail, and we'll have more of that in 2018. So yet another thesis that somebody could do is to use these data. There's so much in these data that I can't study, even me and my students can't all study together. It's all public, and so please use it and dig into some of these things that haven't been dug into before. And that's definitely one of them. That's clearly an increase in the multi-site phenomenon and all the permutations of it. And, okay. Okay, that's the trends. Like I said, there are way more trends that we could talk about, and, but those are the ones we pulled out to give some broader context. Now I want to shift to this theme of congregations and the arts and talk about it in the context of, well, so here's how I want to set it up. Yes?
Could you clarify before you go on what you mean by congregations? From the congregation study, I seem to remember that it included, it wasn't focused only on Christian congregations.
Yes.
But in your past few slides, you have talked about churches.
Yes, yes.
So when you now say congregations, are we still in church land or
Yes.
are we in
I can.
congregations?
Yeah, sorry about the confusion. The National Congregation Study it's local places of worship. It's not just Christian churches. There are synagogues, there are mosques, there are Hindu temples. As a practical matter, the vast majority of the congregations in the National Congregation Study are Christian churches because that's what's out there in the United States. So the non-Christian congregations are all in these data, but they're just a small part. So there are not enough of them to isolate out, to study separately. And I do fall back into churches sometimes just as but everything I'm showing you is actually congregations almost everything. There's a few things that maybe I just looked at the Christians, but it wouldn't matter much. I mean, in the whole National Congregation Study, in any given year where we have, say, 1,300 congregations, maybe 20 of those are synagogues, and maybe another 20 are spread with everybody else. So that's the proportions.
So with the questions up there earlier about do you clap your hands or do you do different things, was that specifically for Christians?
No, that would have had everybody in the denominator, and right, they're not applicable, obviously, to some traditions. But yes, they're there. But again, even if I took them out of the denominator, it wouldn't change very much because there's so few of them in the study. But they do get asked the questions, and they generally answer them. They say no. The Muslims, mainly don't have music, at all. And so, I think in the National Congregation Study, 97% of all congregations have music at their last worship service. But so the ones who don't, there's certain traditions, obviously. So that is something to keep in mind here. Okay, what do congregations do? What they mainly do is kind of obvious. They do their core religious, activities. They do worship services. They do religious education. They do pastoral care, obviously. But they do other things as well. They, you might think of as ancillary. Some people would think they're more central, or byproducts of pursuing these main activities. And the two main ones that people have focused on are social services and politics. Some of you may remember the faith-based initiative in the Bush administration when we paid a lot of attention to what congregations did in terms of social service activities. These days, but for a while now, obviously, people are interested in congregations and what they do politically. There's less attention to congregations and the arts. And the point I want to make, which maybe is obvious to this group, but I think is not obvious in general, is that of these three, if we ask what's the most important thing that congregations do in terms of how much time they spend and staff time, it's not social services and politics, it's the arts. And that's the point. So if I run out of time and I don't get to all the details, that's the point. But let me show you some documentation of that. This surprises some people and it disappoints some people. The social gospelers obviously are very disappointed that it's not the social services. But anyway, congregations do a lot of social services. 80% say they did some kind of social services in the last year. Fewer, but a non-trivial amount. Congregations are obviously involved in politics as well. About a third, say we ask 8 or 9 different political activities, about a third say that they did something. But when we go to the arts, almost everybody, this is the number I sort of said a minute ago, almost all of them do some sort of musical activity in the last week. Obviously, this is mainly because worship, in most cases, contains music, not just music, also drama sometimes and dance. And there's more music than there is politics or social services in congregations. It's not just, though, because of what happens in, it's not just about music. 78% of congregations did some kind of non-musical arts activity in the last year, did a skit of some sort. And, so it's not just about music and worship, and it's not just about worship, because of course congregations also, put on a show of some sort. In fact, 38% say that they did that in the last year. So, at this basic level, what percentage of congregations are doing any of these things? More of them are doing something that's artistic. Obviously, we're not talking about necessarily high art here. We're not even talking, we're not talking about necessarily beauty, but we're talking about, experiencing music or drama or dance in some fashion. So 43% had some kind of a small group that attended a live performance somewhere. We have a whole set of questions about various kinds of small groups they might have had. This is from that. So more churches engage in the arts. But it's not just that more engaged, the artistic activity also engages more people. So the social service crowd in the church, might be 15 or 20 people who are, doing the work in the homeless shelter once a week or something like that. There's the political group who is doing the community organizing stuff that's happening. But then there's the choir, and then the average congregation of the choir is a lot bigger than those other groups. That's kind of the bottom line. The artistic activity is involving more people in the congregations. It's a more intense activity, and it also involves more staff time. A lot more of the staff time of congregations isn't. We know this from time diary studies of clergy, who say how much time they spend in various kinds of activities. And obviously, maybe it's not obvious, but it's true that the head clergy or sole clergy person spends way more time constructing a worship service than engaging in community activities, the average person. If there's other staff, the other staff's way more likely to be a musician. A youth person is the other main kind of other staff person there is, but then a social service person or someone who's in charge of political activities. So it's not just that, sure, congregations have music and worship service. The artistic activities involve more people and use more staff time. Okay. So what I've been saying is, if that's the circle of everything congregations do, I've been saying that, there's some social services, there's some politics, but more of it is arts. But now I want to switch perspective a little bit. Oops, too many arrows at once. Because a more difficult, but in a way more interesting question is not, so let me do it this way. I've been saying, this is what congregations do. This is all the social service political activity in the society. And this separately is what congregations do. This is all the live arts in the society. And obviously that's also true. We're talking about live arts here, not obviously people listening to the radio. I've been saying that this intersection as a proportion of that, well, what I've been saying is this intersection as a proportion of that is bigger than that as a proportion of that. That's what I've said so far. Now I want to switch it to the more difficult and maybe more important and say, well, what about the other direction? Is it true if you take are congregations more important to the live arts sector of the society than they are to the social service, politics, activity sector of the society? Do you see what I'm doing there? That's shifting the perspective. The first perspective was, to what extent are these activities important for congregations? But we can also ask, to what extent are congregations important to these arenas in the society? Again, I'll show you some support for it. This is a much more difficult thing to try to nail down. The truth is I can't nail it down. There's no really good way, because how do you measure? I'll show you some things that make it plausible, but again, the bottom line is going to be yes. The bottom line is going to be congregations are more important to the live arts sector in the country than they are to the social service. There's a couple of hands, yeah.
So, does this congregations disclude religious groups that exist solely for social services or primarily for social services? So So if you think of like the Little Sisters of the Poor or something like that.
Yes.
Like that's what they do. They're
Yes.
different entities.
Yeah, that's a different thing. That's right. So this is just congregations. They're doing worship services as their main thing. That's right. So that would change the picture, because obviously there's religious organizations that are social service organizations that aren't congregations. That's right. That's a separate thing. Yes. Thanks for that clarification.
Another way maybe to examine this trend or whatever is to look at the church's budgeting for
Yes.
all these various things. I'm wondering if you have data for that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't offhand, but it's got to be true because of the staff. A lot of the church budgeting is
Sure,
about
but
staff.
many people here can attest that church musicians aren't always paid.
Right.
Whereas the soup kitchen costs a lot of money.
Well, not as much as you think, because the soup kitchen is often about volunteers going to help a not secular nonprofit that's running a soup kitchen, and what the churches are doing is showing up with volunteers. Yeah, it's true the musicians may not get paid more, but I'm going back here because I do have some data on just what percentage of staff, more paid staff are musicians than are doing other things. Let me just put it that way. Even though sometimes they're not paid. If they have paid staff, they're more likely to be musicians than social service people. The only thing that's comparable is youth, just people who work with youth. That's often another kind of staff person that shows up, a paid staff person. I do have some staff numbers. I'm not finding them immediately, but qualitatively, that's the answer to that. So yeah, as little as the musicians might get paid, there's more paid musicians than there are paid people in these other sectors. Let me show you some other numbers here. So if we ask, so now we're trying to ask how important are congregations to this larger sector? What percent of people heard live singing instruments? This is what percent of Americans experienced live music in a congregation in the last year. And by putting some things together, it's about 60% of people kind of thinking almost all worship has music, what percent attend worship, and so on. There are surveys of Americans about participation in the arts. So we know what percent attended a pop music concert, 39, saw a musical play, heard live classical music, heard live jazz, heard live opera. Obviously, those numbers, you think those are too big? Nah. Why is that funny? I'm just curious. Just because they seem too big?
It seems small compared to how much like that is, at least to
What
me,
you all
it's
do.
like such an important part of
Yeah, okay. All right, fair enough. My point is that number's a lot bigger than those numbers. So it's clearly true that the vast majority of the live music that Americans experience, they experience in churches. That's the point, yeah.
If there was a concert held in a place of worship, like a church, would that count as heard live singing instruments in the congregation?
No, that happens too, though. So if we added that in, that would increase that. There's a conceptual issue here, of course, which is, what does it mean to experience art? Do people think they're experiencing art when they experience music in a congregation? And that's an interesting thing to say. Does it count? If you go to an opera, you kind of know you're experiencing art. Whereas if you hear, you may or may not think of it that way. If you hear a soloist, even a very good soloist in church, so there's a subjective aspect to this that's important to interpreting this. But let me show you with dance. You can't quite say a majority, but it's still a big chunk. 14% of Americans saw dance performed in worship service in the last year, compared to 20% who saw it anywhere. So it's not a majority with dance in churches, but it's a pretty big chunk. Similarly with drama, again, we're not talking about quality here. We're bracketing issues of quality. 14% saw a skit or play in worship compared to saw a non-musical play anywhere from that. So a big chunk of Americans' experience of live arts is in church.
Anywhere inclusive of the internet, such as YouTube?
No, this is live. This is these surveys. These other numbers are from NEA, National Endowment for the Arts surveys, and I believe that was all about live. Yeah, obviously it would be different if we talked about non-live, which that would be different. Okay, so what about social services? This is from a survey of people who receive public services in the Lehigh Valley. some of them get it from their congregation, about a fifth of people, but more got it from a secular social service agency, a public welfare, so it's not a majority, like it was in the arts. Political activity. There was a survey in the 90s about where people, in what context are people asked to take a political action. About a fifth say I was asked to do my congregation. So we don't want to say that's a trivial amount of this, but it's less, relatively speaking, than it is for the arts congregations as a proportion of all of it. And it's not just about consuming it, of course. We can ask, well, what about practicing civic skills on the politics side, doing art, singing, participating in a play? Again, it's the same basic picture. This is from the same survey of politics. They asked where you got to do things like attend a decision-making meeting, plan a decision-making meeting, make a speech, write a letter, do the things that are civic skills. And people do them in church, but they do them at work, for example, much more than they do them at church. So you see the picture I'm trying to paint. Qualitatively speaking, less of this all of it as a proportion of everything that's happening in the society, less of politics and social services is happening in churches than when it comes to arts. Artistic skills, I don't know where about 2/3 of Americans say sing in congregations, compared to 24% who play an instrument, 11% who have performed music or sing music from musical plays. I don't think that means in the shower, that's performance. So more people are doing it in church as well.
I'm wondering about whether your data has information about socioeconomic disparity.
Yes.
There are people who have more access to their churches than to other
Yes.
means, both for the
Yes, we know, we do know information about, yes, we know that. I can tell you that for the political skills, that was a big part of that study on politics, is that churches are way more important as sites of learning civic skills for lower SES people who don't have jobs where they practice those skills. Yet another thing, I've never looked to see whether how the participation in the art stuff would vary by social class. That would be an interesting thing to look at. It seems likely that it's different and different, so that would be yet another thesis that somebody could do. Yeah, even volunteering. There's this from yet another survey about if you volunteered, tell me where you volunteered. So the percent of volunteering that people said, yeah, I did it at my congregation, that much, a quarter of all volunteering having to do with food is at congregations, less having to do with clothing, providing direct care. If people volunteered for the arts, meaning they either performed for free or they were an usher or an MC at a show or something like that, 2/3 of all the volunteering in cultural or artistic activities happened I find that kind of remarkable. I was very surprised when I saw that. So I've shown you a lot of numbers, but really I'm making a qualitative claim, because these numbers, you can't put them all together into a single decisive measure of the magnitude of this stuff. And I'm not sure whether I should say congregations' share of or importance to politics and social services is moderate and their participation in arts is a lot, or whether I should say congregations' participation in social services and politics is a lot and arts is really a lot, but I'm making the claim that there are more significant chunk of those arenas in the society as a whole in the arts than they are in social services and politics. That's the qualitative claim that I'm making. And there it is in not quite black and white, but yellow and blue or something. The arts, not social services or politics, is the secular public arena in which congregations are most present. I think that's a worthwhile corrective to what I think a lot of the public wisdom is about this, which is that it's mainly, and certainly the public attention on congregations and social services and politics.
Given the decline of arts in school curriculum, have you collected any data about the influence of congregations in arts training?
That's really, I have not, and I think that's a really important, that would be a very interesting study to mount, because, yeah, obviously schools are
Given what you've
declining.
shown about
Yeah.
the importance of congregations in art experience.
Yes, I agree. I have not done it, and I agree that that would be, especially given those declines, which are important. Yeah, that would be yet another study that you can't use these data for, but somebody should do that. And absolutely, somebody else. This is, that's it. So that's all I have.
Super, super interesting. Thank you very, very much indeed. We've got about 13 minutes for questions and answers. Our normal protocol is I ask my colleagues, faculty, fellows, who kind of sit on their hands for a few minutes here, so we get students asking questions. We've already greased the wheels, students, so good for you. But let me just moderate if you don't mind.
Okay.
Let's hear some more questions. Yeah.
I was really intrigued by the wording of the questionnaire. So specifically, like the last one that focused on, I know I believe in God and I have no doubts about it.
Mm-hmm.
And was wondering if there's been any discussion about that wording, just the way that it kind of creates a certain idea of what faith, or like kind of like, is that making sense?
Yes. Yes, there's constant discussion about the literal wording of all of this, because the literal wording matters a lot. There's all kinds of things to say about that. One general thing that, there it is. So this is from the General Social Survey, which has been going on since 1972. This item has been asked since 1988, I think. So there's a trade-off, because in 1988 somebody wrote this question. And so we have a baseline. And then they've asked it every 2 years since 1988. So we now have, is that 30 years of data on this. If you change the question, you lose the ability to track the trend. And so people who do surveys, especially surveys over time, are constantly grappling with this issue of, we know if we were writing this today, we'd probably write it differently. But if we started over, we'd lose the, so I don't mean that as a defense of it, but it's an explanation for why there's this strong conservative bias when it comes to changing question wordings in a survey that's been going on for a long time. But it's certainly always legitimate to think about what that means and what the limits of that are. Did you have a specific thing that you wanted to point out? Hey, is there something you'd want to add to the?
No, I'm wondering, just going along with the change that we're seeing and seeing how, just the limits that creates, and even what it's saying about, to me, like faith kind of has this, you look through the Psalms, you look through the Bible, and you see people who are men and women of God who have doubts, but that doesn't take away that like they're very much believing in God and practice that. And so wondering at what point, with kind of tradition that makes complete sense about the trend, but at what point do we break from that to try to have a more representative?
That's an important question, and at some point, there comes a point where you do have to give up on another one that's even more difficult than this, in my opinion, is questions about the Bible. It's really, really hard to give 4 or 5 statements about people's views about the Bible that capture what you'd like to capture about the different ways that people think about biblical authority or inspiration or relevance for today, and that's even harder to do. So it's a really important question to think about.
I saw Gabe, and then 1, 2, 3, and could you just say your name before you ask your question?
My name is Gabe. My question is, have you done any comparative studies in terms of global data with the data that you've had? And that's a pretty broad question, but I'm just curious how the trends in America potentially compare to trends that are going on in the rest of the world or even another country. Maybe you could speak a bit on that.
Yes. So on the individual side of things like belief in God and church attendance and that kind of thing. There's lots of international comparisons. And the bottom line there is that, well, as I started to say, the U.S. is way more religious than any other Western country. The trends, our decline is slower. The rest of the Western world has declined much faster than the United States. But the big question for the future is whether whether they're just ahead of us and we're on the same trajectory, or whether we really are exceptional. You know, the basic question of American religious exceptionalism. And that's a serious question because we're so much more religious than they are still. I think, I really don't know. I mean, it's hard to make predictions about this stuff, especially about the future. I try very hard not to do that. But there are, the main reason to think we're maybe on the same trajectory as the rest of the Western world is that the underlying causes of this, or at least the proximal causes, is about generational change. And that's the same in, all over the Western world as here. And the generational change, I could show you graphs about it's really dramatic. And it's not just that today's young people are less religious, that there's no qualitative break. Your grandparents are a little less religious than your great-grandparents. In the aggregate anyway, I don't mean to be personal, but and so on the congregation side, there are starting to be national congregation studies in other countries modeled after this one, but that's a more recent phenomenon. But on the individual, we know a lot actually about that.
2, 3, Sarah, you're 4, and then Andrew, you're 5. So say your name.
All right, that means you have 15 seconds per question.
Okay, I wanted to look at that card very
Yeah,
quickly.
getting over here.
And pardon?
Quick questions, shorter answers.
Yes. The third item is the one that confused me.
Here?
Yes, personal God, higher power. Personal God, first of all, has a strong Protestant ethos to it, but I wonder if that is linked to the spiritual, not religious growth in some way, because it uses language which we don't want to use nowadays.
Yeah, maybe. I was just looking up, just FYI, the personal God one. I can't read. I don't see my glasses.
Because you mentioned that was
12 right now. 12% of Americans say that.
Okay.
I don't believe in personal, but I do believe in a higher power.
And you mentioned 18% were spiritual but not religious.
Yes, something like that. Yeah, that's right. So you could correlate those two. I haven't done it. I don't know if that's possible.
How does race map onto the language you used of formality or informality in worship practices?
Some of those trends, some of those formality things are specific to certain traditions. I think I showed you the choirs one is not, I did break that down by race, and black churches are not declining the number of choirs. Those trends are mainly trends within white Protestantism, some within Catholicism. I suspect that some of them, I'd have to look item by item to tell you, but a big part of that story is a white Protestant story. That's true.
And it's a term you must have inherited from previous surveys.
Yes, that's true too. Yes, that's true too.
Sarah.
I'm interested if you can tell us about the demographics of the people who designed this survey.
The National Congregation Study or the General Social Survey?
The General Social Survey.
Yeah, so the General Social Survey is, it's been going on since 1972. The originator of it was someone named Jim Davis, who was a Harvard professor for a long time. He's a white male. But once it got established, it's done by a board. It's constructed by a board of social scientists. I was chair of that board for a while. And that board for a long time has been, by intention, mixed. There's 12 or 14 people on it, and it's rotating. People have 2-year terms, and it's by intention racially and ethnically mixed. So really, the very beginnings of it was one guy wrote a survey, but then it became established as a major thing, and it got more collectivized, so to speak. So, and that board is in charge of writing the survey every 2 years.
And religiously mixed as well?
Yes, and religiously mixed as well.
Andrew and Daniel.
I'm interested in the kind of uptake in kind of larger churches, people leaving smaller churches. there kind of a sociological perspective or data about, critical mass? So you walk into a church that has 3 people, you decide, I'm just wondering if there's data behind that.
Yeah, there's no magic number, I don't think, that as a basis. I do think the critical mass question is an important one. I do think that's part of that story is the economics of what a church of a certain size can do. It used to be a 150-person church could mount more stuff than a 150-person church can do today because of increasing. So I think the critical mass for mounting, having a youth minister, for example, that you pay, the critical mass for that has gone up, I think, and that's part of that story. But there's no magic number that I know of that.
So my name is Daniel. I feel a tension between your emphasis on the need for more support for arts, or the importance of the arts, which would be a good support for more support for it, and then the declining of the church, congregation members, budget. Similarly. So I'm just curious because of course we would all want it to be better supported so more musicians can get jobs and so on. But given the constraints, I was curious if you personally have thought about some big picture approaches or ways of supporting the arts through the congregations.
Not really.
Not the role of the sociologist.
Yeah, that's right. That's not my job. I will say the one thing, though, is this consolidation that's happening, this concentration that's happening, I think is changing a lot about the job markets and will into the future. I'm not saying I'm in favor of that as the model, but it seems to me that's in fact what's happening in ways that are impacting and will continue to impact which there'll be fewer but bigger churches that can hire the professional people with real jobs.
In that consolidation, you're not mapping that against any trends in urbanization, growing urbanization?
Yes, I have done that. Yes, I don't have it here. The timing doesn't, because urbanization really has been going on the whole 20th century and really picked up right after World War II with the biggest, whereas this started in the 70s. Yeah. So maybe there was a lag. Yes, it's true. It seems like it has to be part of the story. But it's not as simple. So, for example, if you track the concentration of retail into malls, it exactly maps the movement of the people into urban and suburban areas. Whereas the church one, there's a 30-year lag. So, we can tell a story about why that lag might be, and it's still part of the story, but it's more complex.
What Phoenix was asking a minute ago. There's time for one more question. Paula, you already asked something.
Sort of dovetailing off what Daniel said, are there large-scale data about how congregations have spent their money in the face of declining memberships and pledges and whatever else, and how it affects arts, especially arts involvement?
I love the fact that all the musicians ask about money.
Money question. Not really, no. There is no large national study of congregational budgets over time. There's certain things you can get at. Right now, there's a national survey going on where they're trying to ask detailed questions about money. As you might imagine, congregations are less likely to participate in that survey on that subject than if you ask them about how many people are in your choir. So it remains to be seen the quality of data they'll create, and no matter what, it hasn't been done in the past, so it's hard to see over time. But that's an absence in our knowledge base, is detailed budget, how congregations are spent. We know something about it. There's been local studies and so on, but not a big national report.
3 things for me